Welcome to this explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because, wow, we are taking on a topic of truly massive historical scope. We're going to examine the history, the reality, and the lasting legacy of global communist regimes. It's one of those subjects that has absolutely shaped the modern world in profound ways, and we are going to look strictly at the data, the historical records, and the sociological research to unpack exactly what happened. And to kick things off, we're going to start with this incredibly provocative question. I mean, just think about this for a second. How exactly did an economic and political theory, something penned way back in the middle of the 19th century, leap off the pages of a manifesto and eventually come to govern a staggering one-third of the entire global population? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, unbelievable scale of it. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, over a third of humanity lived under communist governments. This wasn't just some fringe, localized movement. It was quite literally one of the two dominant global systems of the era. It completely restructured the daily lives, the economies, and the political realities of billions of people across the globe. So, to make sense of this giant puzzle, here is our roadmap. We're going to hit 1. Origins of an ideology. 2. Roots of communist regimes. 3. The Soviet superpower era. 4. Realities of communist rule. 5. Decline in global impact. And finally, 6. Communist regimes today. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, Origins of an Ideology. From Plato to Marx. Let's trace where these ideas actually came from long before any government ever tried to put them into practice. Right, so at its core, communism is defined as a doctrine aiming to establish a society based on collective ownership. The ultimate goal? Eliminating social classes, money, and eventually even the state itself. But here's a fun fact. The origins of this kind of class-free, egalitarian society actually trace all the way back to ancient Greece in Plato's Republic. But if we fast forward to 19th century Europe, we see it evolve dramatically. Thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels fundamentally redefined communism. They framed it as a direct, socialist response to the genuinely miserable, brutal conditions urban factory workers were facing under early capitalism, and that ultimately led them to publish the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Section 2. Roots of Communist Regimes. The Catalysts for Revolution. Now, we know the theory was born in the rapidly industrializing West, but let's look at where it actually took hold. And here is the fascinating twist. When we look at where these ideas actually manifested into powerful regimes, it wasn't in those advanced industrialized democracies at all. Historian and editor Stephen Anthony Smith points out a really clear pattern here. With very few exceptions, successful communist revolutions took root in countries that were primarily agrarian and technologically backward. We're talking about nations that were plagued by endemic poverty and deep-rooted social inequalities. And crucially, they lacked established traditions of representative democracy or civil liberties. Plus, they were almost entirely conflict-driven. Whether you look at Russia, China, Vietnam, or Korea, the single most overwhelming catalyst for a communist revolution was the absolute devastation and destabilization caused by war. Let's move to and see how this builds. Section 3, the Soviet superpower era, global expansion. We're going from isolated revolutions to a massive global superpower structure. Just look at the incredible acceleration on this timeline. In 1848, it's just a published manifesto, right? But then, boom, by 1917, Vladimir Lenin leads the Bolshevik Revolution, establishing the Soviet Union as the world's premier communist state. Fast forward to 1949, and Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China. By the mid-20th century, largely modeled after or heavily influenced by the Soviet Union, the ideology just spreads like wildfire across the Eastern Bloc. We're talking Poland, Hungary, East Germany, as well as throughout Asia and all the way over into places like Cuba. Section 4. Realities of Communist Rule. A nuanced look. With such a massive chunk of the globe under one-party communist rule, we really have to look objectively at what everyday life was actually like inside those borders. And this brilliantly illustrates the highly nuanced picture we get from historical and sociological sources. Sociologist Andres Bezoki points out this massive duality that was experienced by literally millions of people. On one side of the ledger, these regimes brought rapid, massive modernization programs. They almost entirely eliminated illiteracy, made incredible strides in accessible healthcare and housing, and saw the mass entry of women into the labor market. But, and this is a big but, on the other side of the ledger, this came at a severe, undeniable cost. Bezoki notes the distinct suppression of civil freedoms, the creation of highly close societies that were entirely dependent on the state, and a really pervasive culture of fear, censorship, and political repression. As you might imagine, the academic debate surrounding these realities is intense. You have political scientist Michael Parenti arguing that these regimes actually accelerated economic development and provided social rights you just didn't find in capitalist states at the time. He suggests that the harsher measures were essentially defensive reactions to the pressures of the Cold War. Conversely, historian David L. Hoffman offers a totally different lens. He notes that many of the most oppressive tools of the state, things like social cataloging and mass surveillance, well, they weren't actually invented by communist regimes. They actually predated them, originating from the total state mobilization required back during World War I. So it's a very complex historical web. Section 5. Decline and Global Impact. The Fall and the Ripple Effect. Because despite the rapid expansion and massive industrialization we saw in the mid-20th century, by the late 20th century, things were changing fast. The premier global communist superpower was facing a complete existential crisis. The sources attribute this overall decline to several really critical internal mechanisms. These states suffered from inherent economic inefficiencies. They just found it incredibly hard to compete with dynamic, developed free markets. They were also totally weighed down by heavy, rigid bureaucracies and a trend toward increasing authoritarianism. As scholar Walter Scheidel points out, despite these wide-reaching government actions, the states ultimately failed to achieve long-term economic and political success based on orthodox Marxism. And of course, this culminated most notably in the total dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. But, okay, here is a truly captivating argument regarding the global ripple effect of these regimes, even outside their own borders. Historians Gary Gerstle and Walter Scheidel argue that the mere threat of communism fundamentally shaped Western capitalist societies. Because Western economic elites were genuinely terrified of a communist revolution happening in their own backyards, they became highly willing to compromise with the working class. This fear directly contributed to the rise of strong labor movements and robust welfare states in the West. Which means, and this is wild to think about, the weekend you enjoy or the labor rights you have today were inadvertently shaped by the very existence of those global communist regimes. Section 6. Communist regimes today, the remaining states. So after the Soviet collapse in 1991, a lot of governments abolished communist rule. But the ideology didn't disappear entirely. So the crucial point is, today, only a handful of nominally communist governments remain. We're looking at 5 countries: China, Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea. They all still operate under a one-party system led by a communist party. However, it is absolutely vital to note that none of these nations, in fact, no historical regime ever, actually achieved that pure communist goal of a truly classless, moneyless society we talked about earlier. And honestly, in order to survive the 21st century, most of these remaining states had to adapt in a major way. Take this number right here, 8%. That was China's poverty rate in 2001. Now, to put that into perspective, during the Mao era, the poverty rate was a staggering 53%. This incredible drop was achieved only after leader Deng Xiaoping introduced the reform and opening up policies back in 1978. Basically, they incorporated market-oriented, competitive reforms while still maintaining strict one-party political control. We actually see similar adaptations in Vietnam and Cuba. After losing their Soviet subsidies, they began attracting foreign investment and moving toward market-oriented economies. But this stands in very stark contrast to North Korea. The sources highlight North Korea as basically the last country still practicing strict, orthodox Soviet-style communism. It remains a highly repressive, rigidly isolated state that entirely rejects global market integration. As we look back at the overarching legacy of the Soviet bloc's fall, Cambridge historian Gary Gerstle leaves us with this incredibly powerful thought. He argues that the collapse of communism didn't just change lines on a map, it changed our global imagination. It created this ideological void, essentially shrinking the space where alternative systems to capitalism could even be conceptualized or incubated. Which leaves us right here, with this final profound question to consider. We so often think of these two systems as entirely separate, completely opposed worlds. But based on everything we've unpacked today, how did the existence and the ultimate fall of global communist regimes inadvertently shape the modern capitalist world we all live in right now? It's a fascinating piece of history to reconsider, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.